question of Pearl Harbor revisited from an anti-fascist viewpoint. And as we heard in part one, that I hope you've all just heard, we're arguing that there is a conspiracy around Pearl Harbor. However, Franklin D. Roosevelt is not the mastermind of the conspiracy. He's a target of the conspiracy, as the United States indeed are. The conspiracy is masterminded by Sir Winston Churchill in London and carried out by a pro-British network, including Colonel Stimson at the War Department, the U.S. Secretary of War, General Marshall, the military commander of the Army, Admiral Stark, the military commander of the Navy, and probably the biggest villain of them all, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, that we see here. And if we go back to the slides where the main interest must always lie, this again is the last word, or one of the last words, from Harry Elmer Barnes, a guy who was a very interesting historian. He was a valid critic of the Versailles Treaty during the 1920s, wrote about the coming of World War I. I think he was a professor at Smith College in Massachusetts. Anyway, the outcome of a lifetime of research for him is not just, as we saw before, that there is no proof that Roosevelt was ever informed by anybody that there was going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor, specifically at the date and time that was ultimately the case. And he also says, look, if you look at it, the person more responsible than anyone else, certainly in the Navy, and that of course is going to be the center of matters, for the Japanese surprise attack is Admiral Richmond K. Turner, the head of the War Plans Division, who, as we see here, took over naval communications and naval intelligence. So with a kind of a bureaucratic coup and end run, he was essentially dictating policy to the entire naval establishment. And this is his letter to another Pearl Harbor historian in 1962, in the last decade of his life. Let's look at some of the lies by Admiral Turner to Congress. Here we are in the post-war hearings, and a congressman asks Turner, did you ever tell Stark, the head of the Navy, that Admiral Kimmel, the Pearl Harbor commander, was getting the code intercepts? The code intercepts in general are called magic, right? Because they're magical. You can make messages appear out of the air. Admiral Turner, yes, sir, on 3 occasions. I asked the chief of naval communications about it, and I told Stark that Kimmel was getting everything. It's a barefaced lie. Now, this is where Kimmel begins to appear more and more as a victim. And certainly, there's no justification for the measures taken against Kimmel, degrading him. And he's being made a scapegoat for the actual conspirators, among them Turner. Again, a month before the attack, the naval aide to the Secretary of the Navy, Knox, asks Turner, is Kimmel getting the magic messages, the code intercepts? Turner says, Beatty, of course he is. He gets the same magic that we have here. Well, of course, Kimmel gets nothing, and this seems to be part of the pattern. Beatty, again, the aide to the Secretary of the Navy, says, Richmond K. Turner is certainly one of the most important persons responsible, if not the man mainly responsible, for Pearl Harbor. And this we find in Pranger's Pearl Harbor, the Verdict of History, a balanced but empirical account. So here we have a lot of people who have devoted their entire lives to this, starting from a point of view which is completely different from my own. They converge on Richmond K. Turner, and I think this gets us very, very close to the heart of the matter. And again, the Republican report, let's go back to McCollum, right? Stinnett's bête noire, right, his main target. McCollum, having received the east wind rain on December 4th, 1941, prepared a dispatch ordering full alert for the fleets in the Pacific. He tried to get permission to send the dispatch, but he was blocked by Stark, Ingersoll, Turner, and Wilkinson. Namely, Turner. He was discouraged from doing so on the grounds that the message of number 24th and 27th to Kimmel, the war morning, was already sufficient. But this is inadequate. In other words, if you see that the commander is not doing what he's supposed to do, you've got to keep sending, you've got to get on the phone again and again and again. And there are some locals where you've got to call 10 times before they'll finally do what you want. But that's your job. You have to do that. Otherwise, you shouldn't be in the general staff. And there he is. Richmond K. Turner. There's a warship named after him these days. And again, he's no creature of Roosevelt. He's an enemy of Roosevelt. A couple of other things we can say about him. He's in some way hooked into the British faction. In other words, he owes his career to the Admiral Sims faction in the Navy. And I would invite people to go and look into this, because I have not had time to document all that in any detail. Look, a missing slide. We needed Admiral Stark. We'll get him there soon enough. Now, notice one thing. One of the things that Turner then does is he becomes the commander of the amphibious forces in the Pacific Fleet. Now, I hope you know the polemic between MacArthur and the Navy in World War II. The Navy says, we have to have frontal amphibious assaults on highly fortified Japanese islands, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Truk, Peleliu, and all the rest. This is how most people get killed. General MacArthur says, forget all that stuff. Don't go where they are, go where they're not. And he goes all the way from Australia to Tokyo with 50,000 casualties, which is less than the Battle of the Bulge, less than the Anzio landing, less than a whole series of battles in Europe in World War II. So, again, it just shows that MacArthur is the good general. The British plan is, of course, that World War II is going to go on until about 1955. The Japanese are going to have several years to fortify everything. The U.S. is going to come back in after the war in Europe is over. The U.S. is then going to have a series of bloody frontal assaults by the Marines on these heavily fortified islands. U.S. war dead, 2 to 3 million, comparable to the French in World War I. Right? This is what they would like for the U.S. under Churchill. As we see now. The British are defeatist in the Pacific. They don't reinforce Singapore, right? Their big fortress in Malaya. Averell Harriman, representing the British side, says that everything between India and South America is one vast, doomed area. Well, that's way more than half the surface of the Earth. So you're going to leave, give them 5 years to fortify, and then you're going to come back in with these crazy frontal assaults. It might have been 10 million U.S. dead at the rate these people were going. Let's take an example, the Brisbane Line. Okay, this is something that came out of World War II. The idea, of course, is from our dear friend Churchill. Now, here's the Brisbane Line. See, here's Australia, right? It's about the size of the continental United States. The main population, of course, is down here. Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra is in here somewhere. Brisbane, right? The people are basically all here. This is completely empty. There's some population over here, population over here. The rest of this is empty. This is tropical. I've been up here, Banana Shire. This is basically a rainforest, right? Bananas. Here's your Great Barrier Reef and all the rest of it. Now, the British plan is you can't defend Australia. The Australian divisions are in North Africa fighting Rommel. So they say, what we're going to do is abandon everything except this quadrant right here. And you can see the Brisbane Line. So the Japanese get to take all this. And then you're going to come back in this area the size of the continental United States. Maybe the U.S. losses are up to 20 million now when you do that. And of course, they'd run the war with these lunatic frontal assaults. So you can see that if you really let the Japanese run wild for 5 years and fortify everything, it's going to be an immense, immense task. And there's no reason for that. Here's a good book, The Truth About the Brisbane Line. Now this is the Australian Prime Minister Menzies, or Means. And what this is a left-wing pamphlet saying this guy was pro-Hitler, an appeaser, he's pro-fascist, he likes Franco in Spain. He quit the militia in 1914, he's a coward, and all the rest of it. This guy is one of the theoreticians of retreating to the Brisbane Line, saying you can't fight Japan anywhere except retreat to the Brisbane Line. Here's another book about it. So this is a live issue in Australia. Probably people here don't know a whole lot about it. So I think these are some of the things that Stinnett has neglected. But now maybe we get to the codes. Here we go with the codes. This is now the conclusion. Now, the big thing with Pearl Harbor is the code intelligence, right? That code messages of the Japanese are being intercepted. Now, we've seen that they don't go to Admiral Kimmel and Admiral Short in Hawaii. The big question is, does Roosevelt have them? What did he know and when did he know it? Does Churchill have them? What did he know? When did he know it? Now, some codes work with machines, right? I think this is a German Enigma machine, 3 rotors, right? 3-rotor Enigma. They got up to 4-rotor Enigma. It's basically a code machine. I won't go into the details of how this is done. I'm really not an expert. I could give you a crude account, but it's probably better not. The Emperor's New Codes. The Japanese have one system for diplomatic, and they even have different systems. Let's put it this way. They have a group of codes for diplomatic purposes and a group of codes or ciphers for military purposes. Now, remember the famous movie, Midway? And here we have Charlton Heston is the guy on the carrier, and Hal Holbrook here is Rochefort. And Rochefort, you see, he's an eccentric. He wears a smoking jacket. He's the code breaker of Midway. And he's saying, tell the admiral the Japanese are going to attack Midway. And they say, well, how, are you sure? And he says, well, we can't be sure. And then he says, put out a report that the water tank on Wake Island is, the water tank on Midway is busted. So the Japanese then send a code that says, water tank on Island X is busted. So from this he says, look, I can never prove it to you, because he couldn't read Midway in the Japanese code, but he could read generally what they were doing. Now the trick with Midway is, it's about 6 months after Pearl Harbor. So by 6 months after Pearl Harbor, not this guy of course, but the real person that he's playing, could read much of the Japanese fleet code. But at the time of Pearl Harbor, 6 months earlier, there's every indication that the U.S. could not read the fleet code, except for 5 to 10% of the simplest stuff, which meant that you couldn't figure out. It'd be like reading 5% of a foreign language. You wouldn't be able to get very far. So, Rochefort in Midway solves what is called JN25. This is the absolute crucial issue, and it's the point where you defeat Stinnett completely, because now you're no longer in the area of opinion. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, with tremendous resources already miraculously available, he guides Nimitz in the Battle of Midway, June 1942, 6 months later. Now, in the U.S. government, this is a list of the people who get the Japanese code intercepts. And they're of two types. One is called Purple. Purple is the diplomatic code. The other one is JN25, the fleet code. Those are the two main ones. Now the secret of the entire thing is, the U.S. at the beginning can read Purple. The U.S. gives the British a Purple machine. So the British can now read Purple. So the U.S. and the British read Purple. The U.S. cannot read JN25, the 5-number fleet code, but the British can. So the British have a monopoly. The British know what the Japanese are going to do. And according to everything I've seen except that one hearsay note, the Japanese movements are known to the British, and the British don't tell the U.S. This is the heart of the matter. This is the conspiracy in its starkest form. It's also interesting that among the U.S. characters, who gets to see the magic? Stimson, Marshall, all these guys, the Army intelligence guy, Richmond K. Turner, Stark, McCollum, Kramer, but not the president. In other words, the story of Pearl Harbor is not really, does Roosevelt share intelligence with the Navy? It's the Navy denies intelligence to Roosevelt. And of course, the invisible government in general denies it to Roosevelt. See, here are the two ones. The codes in general are known as Magic or Ultra. The Purple code is the Japanese Foreign Ministry and embassies. So if you want to know what the Japanese ambassador is going to say tomorrow, read Purple. The JN25, 5-number code, Code Book D, is the fleet code. So if you want to know what the aircraft carriers are going to do tomorrow, read JN25. And they don't talk about the same things, because they're all very terse and laconic. Purple, broken by the US, shared with the UK. JN25, broken by the British, they called it Black Jumbos, BJs, Blue Jackets, but not shared with the US. Perfide Albion, once again. Now look who does not get, and all the US has is purple. So, but now, if I say magic on the US side is only purple, because the other one they can't read. Who does not get it? Roosevelt does not get it. The Secretary of State who should know this because this is his business, is not given the Japanese diplomatic code intercepts. Who decided? Marshall, Invisible Government, and Stark, obviously in league or under the domination of the Invisible Government. So there's a period, here, let me just show you, I have this written up better. Marshall and Stark, how can you not give the president the codes? This, by the way, shows up in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. Remember? When one of these guys comes in the office, he says, what, you're not going to give the president the codes? And the other one says, yeah, we think he's got communist advisors. They don't like Harry Hopkins, they don't like the New Deal, and they accuse them of putting the code intercepts in the wastebasket in the White House. That they're not sufficiently, good custodians of the secrets. Now, no purple for Roosevelt from late September 1940 through January 23rd, 1941. So we have a 4-month period where Marshall, I believe acting for Stimson, along with Stark, cut off the intercepts to Roosevelt. And, maybe even more dramatic, no magic for Roosevelt from May 1941 to 12th of November 1941. Basically, 10 days before the Japanese task force sails to attack Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt is getting 0 diplomatic codes from the Army and the Navy. So it's a total of 4 months approximately and 6 months. So it's 10 months. The president is being deprived of the codes by the goddamn invisible government. Heavy stuff. This is from Russ Bridger and Nave. Again, Stinnett is not interested in this. In the movie, Tora, 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 this is E.G. Marshall playing Rufus Bratton. He's the guy who discusses with his counterpart, this is the Navy guy, Kramer, again in the movie. These two notice before Pearl Harbor that they're now told, don't take the code intercepts to the president. That comes out in the movie. And it's true. This is amply justified. Okay. So let's see where we are. Let's just see. Where are they listening? The British have a listening post in Hong Kong. The U.S. has one in Corregidor, in Hawaii, in San Francisco, in Maryland. The British have Singapore, Hong Kong, we said, New Zealand, all over the place, right? So these are the ones. The whole thing is called OP-20G. That's the Navy code-breaking operation. Station Hypo, Hawaii, Station Cass, the Philippines, and the On the Roof Gang in Washington or Cheltenham, Maryland, at different times. The British could read JN-25, the BJs. They do read it. Admiral Layton of the U.S. points out that the British could read JN-25. The U.S. Navy could not read JN-25. This guy who was working, this is the On the Roof Gang. We were reading a tiny fraction, 10% of a given message. Here's another guy. This is Station Cast, Cavite, Corregidor. I knew we did not read the JN-25 code. The first one we could really read was March 13th, 1942. And the question, by this time we're into the Midway stuff, but that's 3 or 4 months later, and now with tremendously increased resources. Here's another guy. We could read small messages in JN-25, but we couldn't read it on a general basis. We didn't have enough staff. A higher level guy, this is Burla. He's a well-known writer, quite a famous person. He writes to the U.S. ambassador in London. A feeling has grown up in certain U.S. circles that while there is full interchange on our side, certain information has not been forthcoming from the British side. An understatement, to put it mildly. Now, one of the ways that Stinnett, I think, tricks his readers is he goes into the files and he says, oh, but look, I see 20,000 JN-25s all translated. Yes, translated in 1946 when the war was over and all those guys had nothing else to do because there were no more JN-25s coming out. So, and in this group, there are several dozen messages that give you the clear lowdown the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. But these have been intercepted by the U.S., but they can't be read. And as a matter of fact, there's a difference between what do you intercept, what can you spell, in other words, you make it into letters, and then what you read. In other words, to make it intelligible in terms of knowing the content, you have to intercept it, you have to break it out, and then you have to make it into intelligible language, and also translate. Here's the Rusper-Genève thesis. We show that Churchill was aware that a task force had sailed from northern Japan in late November 1941, and that one of its likely targets was Pearl Harbor. Churchill deliberately kept this vital information from Roosevelt as a means of fulfilling his desire to get America into the war at any cost. And again, I would say it's worse than what they think, getting it into the war at the maximum cost to balance the post-war world so the British remain important. Roosevelt was deceived by Churchill, who took a ghastly gamble to bring America into the war, sweeping aside opposition. Roosevelt is also badly served by his divided and jealous subordinates. These authors are generally not aware of the British network problem. They're not aware of the Sims, Benson, MacArthur, Pershing, Marshall faction fights in the U.S. military. Churchill's gamble paid off, but the British lost an empire. And again, they say Turner and others concealed purple and JN-25. In other words, Turner knew that there was JN-25, and he never went to Roosevelt and said, here, the British are withholding what they knew of JN-25. No. And he keeps it away, above all, from the commanders in Hawaii, Kimmel and Short. And again, Roosevelt, the President and the Secretary of State, don't get the purple intercepts for 10 months. Now, Stinnett, how does he get around this? Well, the short answer is he doesn't. He says it's JN-25, the 5-number code. They solved it in February 1940. Now, the problem with this is JN-25 is not a machine. It's a lookup book. It's 80,000 5-letter, 5-number codes, and each one means something, and the only way to know it is to build the dictionary. You have to either capture the book or you build it up. Stinnett talks about this as if a code is something you break and it's broken. In other words, like, Eureka, I found the formula, I can read everything. No. You can find the formula and then you get to work for 6 to 12 months or whatever it is to build the dictionary so you can read the stuff that you're getting, because there is no formula that generates all these things. They're purely arbitrary. They're in a book. They're random, arbitrary numbers. So he's not interested in building up to 30,000 plus, and it's based on other reading, it's more than 30,000. And again, they said we were intercepting, decoding, and translating. Right? Intercepting, decoding, and translating are the 3 phases. But they're not. And again, part of what he's basing this on is he's found the translations, but the translations are from 1946. They're not real-time translations. Okay? So he says, we broke the Japanese operational code and we could follow. And again, he's persistently misleading you because the messages were intercepted in 1941, but they were broken out and decoded in 46, 47. And the Navy also destroyed the entire paperwork of pre-Pearl Harbor code documentation under the leadership of our man, Richard K. Turner. Now here we are at the Independent Institute, not far from here, in 2000. And he says the U.S. had 20% of the code groups at the time of Midway. Right? Well, this is a question now. So if they only had 20% at the time of Midway, what could they have known at the time of Pearl Harbor? How does he answer it? Well, the evidence is against you. And he says, I can quote you the officer in charge of CAST in the Philippines. And he says, we could read. He says, they sent messages to Roosevelt quoting the Japanese ships. We are leaving Corregidor. We are heading towards the Philippines. So the evidence is just overwhelming. But the guy who he's quoting here is somebody called Lieutenant Honest John Lightwiller. And what he's talking about is we could read the, how can I say it? We could break it out, but we couldn't read it. It's a funny thing because there's a formula that generates the numbers, and then there's an additive that's put onto it. I don't want to go into the details, but there's something called superencoding additives. And he is simply ignoring the fact that this exists. So, and the basic thing that he's saying here is simply not true. Okay. Okay, Dwayne Whitlock. Not one single JN-25 on the U.S. side before Pearl Harbor is not a cover-up, but we couldn't read it. It was not within our combined cryptological capacity to produce a usable decrypt at that juncture. Here's one guy who says it's about 7%. This is the Wikipedia article, very well informed. 7% of JN-25 is legible in September, October, November. Out of 55,000, he estimates, 7% legible. Now, just as the last point, remember that the big event of the day is not Pearl Harbor anyway. It's the Philippines and all those bombers, right? They're trying to get the B-17s to the Far East. The idea being with this, you can bomb Japan. Right? You fly right up to, you can bomb Formosa for sure, and if Stalin is your friend, you can bomb Japan and then go land in Russia. And you can do a shuttle bombing over Japan. So they wanted to do this. But 9 hours after Pearl Harbor, and again, militarily, this is much more significant. Right? Here we go, MacArthur's Pearl Harbor, because he indeed was commanding. It's December 8th, because you're on the other side of the international date line. Right? And here's what's left of the B-17s in the Philippines. So the whole Far Eastern Air Force, 9 hours later, is caught on the ground and destroyed. This is actually a much more serious matter. The collapse of Allied air power west of Pearl Harbor. This is actually much worse. A fortnight, 2 weeks of infamy is worse than a day of infamy any day, any month. So again, the 1914 battleship Arizona is of course a tragedy, but in terms of the military naval capabilities, this is overwhelmingly an obsolete piece of hardware. So again, I hope I have been able to sufficiently establish the fact that the chief conspirator is indeed this charming gentleman here. His entire office file for November, December 1941 is still top secret, as far as I know, in the British Public Record Office or National Archive, as they now call it. We want to know, we want the British must now release all these papers. Otherwise, the cloud of suspicion around them grows more and more thick. And I hope I've contributed something to tearing down the Churchill cult carried on by the neocon fascist madmen who try to erect this person into some paragon of virtue, honesty, anti-fascism. And what we've seen is that he was palsy-walsy with Franco in Spain, palsy-walsy with Mussolini in Italy, two leading fascists, and a leading architect of the appeasement of Japan and building up Japan to balance the United States in the Far East. Thank you so much. Thank you for your energy and your staying power.
All very new material to me. I had fallen under the spell of FDR knew and let it happen on purpose, you know. Yeah. So Churchill emerges from your lecture as a geopolitician with a long-range view towards maintaining British dominance through the same playing off of one subordinate against each other, like they were some, you know, Milan and Galeazzo and some, you know, northern Italian Venetians playing the French, etc. Which is, you know, how do I keep the barbarians fighting amongst themselves and prevent the emergence of a rival? So the rival emerging would be the U.S. So
the U.S. and then we'll see later on the Soviets.
So Churchill would pretend then to be a friend of the U.S., but really had a long range after the war view. So his immediate goal is how does he get the U.S. into the war to help him, but also to weaken it as much as possible. Sort of, and something like that played out in China with Chiang Kai-shek allowing the Maoist forces to be weakened, or
Churchill wants to weaken Chiang Kai-shek, and ultimately he wants Mao to win, because he realizes that Mao will be incapable of modernizing China, that Mao will isolate himself through conflicts with Russia. Chiang Kai-shek is very happy to make deals with Stalin. Mao is much harder time getting into good relations with Stalin. So he's looking for a figure who's going to auto-isolate himself and defeat himself. The impulses of his own method.
No, I'll get to it. My question is really then, did FDR become witting? Did he realize that Churchill had thrown him under the bus? And how did this affect their relationship after the war ended?
If you look in the memoirs written by Elliot Roosevelt, it's called As He Saw It, and it is an account of the Tehran Conference, the Yalta Conference in World War II, written by Roosevelt's son, who was a political figure in his own right. And what he describes is a personal hatred and a very tense conflict between Roosevelt and a commitment to break up the British Empire, and Churchill's commitment to maintain the British Empire at all costs and to force the U.S. to commit resources to saving the British Empire. So as Rusbridger and Nave, I think, correctly point out, Churchill's is a desperate gamble. He's going to take the world into war. He's going to spread the world war that's already raging in Eurasia and make it an actual global war. And he hopes to come out of this with the British Empire intact, but it's quite a gamble. And it would not have worked, except for the fact that Roosevelt dies. We can learn from Elliot Roosevelt, writing in the magazine Parade in the early 1970s, when he's quite old. He says, "Stalin told me that Churchill poisoned my father." This is the report from Elliot Roosevelt to Parade magazine saying, Field Marshal Stalin of the Soviet Union confided to me during a visit to Moscow that the Churchill gang poisoned my father and brought about his death. And this, of course, brings in Truman. And Truman, of course, is a figure much beloved by oligarchs today because he's a contemptible little puppet. He's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. You can Watergate him on that. He's a member of the corrupt Pendergast machine of Missouri politics, Kansas City, Missouri. Filthy dirty. His boss was indicted. He could have been indicted at any moment, and he never was allowed to forget this. So Truman is the classic puppet president, run by Atchison. You can read Atchison's books. He tells you how he ran Truman. Harriman ran Truman. Clark Clifford has a book where he describes a system of secret committees around Truman that ran Truman without Truman's knowledge of the fact, because he was such a contemptible little puppet and always subjected to blackmail, indictment, and all the rest of it. So Truman is a monstrous figure. He's really the protagonist of destroying the New Deal coalition, or beginning to destroy it. He uses the army against strikers. It's basically the New Deal coalition beginning to destroy itself under these very, very bad auspices. So that's the kind of thing we get from Churchill. I would also point out, if you want to look up on the internet, and I do hope to prepare a new edition of this sometime, maybe in the next year. In my collection, Against Oligarchy, 1970 to 1996, I also have an essay on how Churchill started the Cold War. Because essentially, in 1945, the position is you have the Soviets now, the US, and the British. And Churchill suffers from what is called the Lepidus complex, right? In the Roman Republic, as I'm sure you know, we have the Triumvirate, right? So we have, what have we got? We've got Octavian, Mark Antony, and M. Aemilius Lepidus, who's the weak sister of the three. So in a world where you've got Stalin with 150 divisions, and Roosevelt with 100 divisions, and a huge navy and atomic bombs, and then you've got this British thing, which is bankrupt, and colonial revolts going on all over the place. It's clear Churchill doesn't count for anything. So Churchill rightly understands that if the US and the Soviets get along, the British will count for nothing. But if the US and the Soviets are at each other's throats, then the British become a precious ally to be courted, to be financed, to be given loans, to be propped up in all sorts of ways. Another good example, and that's really the origin of the Cold War. We could go through that perhaps another time. Another good example, the Atlantic Charter. Now, I have to confess that one of the reasons I wanted to do this report now is that we are now in the party realignment crisis here in the United States, right? It's the summer of 2007, and the party system is breaking up. And the deepest conviction of my life and work over 40 years now is that what we need is a massive return to New Deal economics up and down the line. Without that, this country and the world are doomed. One of the ways that Roosevelt is slandered, and he's slandered in many ways, is based on this Roosevelt set up Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt goaded the Japanese, provoked the Japanese, and so forth. And I've always believed this is wrong, and through a period of enforced idleness this past winter because of an injury, I was able to finally get these books. I have not actually been able to go to the archives, that I must confess, but I've at least gotten the main books on the subject, read all of those, and this is my finding. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill met in the summer of 1941 on the coast of Newfoundland. Right? This is the so-called Atlantic Charter. What's the Atlantic Charter? Well, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It's supposedly the war aims of the Allies, the US and the British in World War II. Now, ironically, no sooner is the ink dry on this tremendous document than Churchill says, that's all very well, but it doesn't apply to the British Empire. Because these guys in India come forward and they say, hey, Atlantic Charter, self-determination, freedom, freedom from fear, freedom from harm. What about us? Gotcha, says Churchill. It's only for the North Atlantic, not for you guys, and not for the British Empire. So that's awful. But what Roosevelt then does, and this is something that people should be aware of, I think it's the great unfinished job right now. In the State of the Union address of January 1944, Roosevelt enunciates the Economic Bill of Rights. The Economic Bill of Rights. And it's clear that what he's got in mind is a series of 6 to 8 constitutional amendments, or some other form of packaging it, that are going to anchor economic rights in the Constitution. Because right now we have a general welfare clause, but nothing specific. What he's talking about is the right to a job, the right to medical care, the right to a retirement, the right to fair competition if you're a small businessman, and a series of other things. It's clear that if Roosevelt had lived into 1946-47, one of the things he would have pushed for is the actual enactment of the Economic Bill of Rights of January 1944 as a series of constitutional amendments. And if that had been done, a lot of the features of the New Deal would have been irreversible, short of an all-out fascist coup d'etat. But right now what we've had is, for the past 40 years, the New Deal, well, to put it another way, the New Deal coalition survived until it was smashed by Lyndon B. Johnson around the Vietnam War. The New Deal died in the streets of Chicago in June of 1968. And I was there myself protesting against Hubert Humphrey and the Democratic war policy in Vietnam. But that was the smashing of the New Deal. And this was done by Johnson, right? His persistence in the Vietnam War. Since then, we've had 40 years of reaction. We've had a decline in the American living standard by 2/3. We've had military defeat in Vietnam, military defeat in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We've had a period of awful reaction, the Southern strategy. We've had, essentially racist values dominating the country. Unions in full retreat, right? Gouging of wages up and down the line, right? The general feeling that people are low-wage economy, people are worthless. I think right now we have a chance. One of the things we have to do is to say we've got to go back to the pre-1968 world, which is essentially the late New Deal. I mean, have you felt nostalgia for the 1950s? Ever, if you can remember it? Well, what are the 1950s? The late New Deal. Obviously, some of us are much too young. All the ladies, for sure. But the world of the 1950s is what? It's the completed New Deal. And it's certainly a better world, with some exceptions. Obviously, there's a lot of racism, there are a lot of very severe problems. But generally, in terms of a belief in progress and a reality of progress that everybody could see from day to day, that was real. So I think we have to go back to it, and I think one of the ways to do it is to really see the achievement of Roosevelt. Because to say that Roosevelt is a monstrous schemer who wants to get everybody killed and destroy his own navy, it tends to completely skew your version of 20th century U.S. history. And I just wanted to try to set that straight, because it seems to me that the revisionists as such, they really have no merit. And that indeed Churchill is a scoundrel of unbelievable proportions. And the gall of the neocons to come forward now with this character. And of course, we're told that in the Oval Office today, little Bush, when he sits at his desk for his 20 minutes a day, behind him, looking over his shoulder, a bust of Sir Winston Churchill. You can read that. There's a psychological profile in the Washington Post during the last week that describes his ego ideal, Churchill. Like, alone, not governed by polls or public opinion, and of course, an out-and-out fascist. Pro-Mussolini, pro-Franco, pro-Japan. Have I kept up, please?
Is there some continuity between the invisible government that was making all this go on and what's going on right now, or was there
the same?
It's the exact same?
The same thing. Same families, same people. Again, the Bush family is part of the OSS CIA at a rather middling level, I would say, but they're there. It's the continuity of the Wall Street banks, the law firms that serve the Wall Street banks. There's places like Sullivan and Cromwell, and that's of course the Dulles brothers law firm is Sullivan and Cromwell. Fascist law firms, people who are involved with Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, the Japanese, similar groups in other countries. And it's an entirely a continuity. What I'm really trying to argue is the invisible government has been calling the shots from behind the scenes since about 1895. And I'll try to show you maybe on Sunday. We go back, I think it begins under Grover Cleveland. And perhaps it's not really a coincidence that people know so little about these people, because I think it's in the interest of the invisible government to cover it up. Because they don't want to tell you about, the Washington Naval Conference as the prelude to Pearl Harbor, right? And recognized as such, as we saw, right? There were guys in the Navy who said, if you really go through with this, you're going to tempt them to come after you sometime soon. And similar stuff. So you get into very obscure areas of history. But Grover Cleveland capitulating to Morgan, that's, I think, the beginning. So called it from 1895 until now, there's always been an invisible government. The Federal Reserve Act institutionalizes a power relation which is there for 10 or 15 years before that, but then it makes it solid. The one thing people may not know, the only president who successfully bucked the Federal Reserve is
the Stumpy.
Roosevelt. It's Roosevelt. The way this was done was in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve was so hated that Roosevelt could say to them, look, I can bend my little finger and the Congress will vote you out of existence at my order. And they knew it. So unfortunately, that's what he should have done. This is a big mistake by Roosevelt, by the way. This is where I would criticize him a great deal. He got in this arrangement where he would call them up and he'd say, we have a bond issue coming due next week, and you're going to buy it at 1 2/3%. Is that clear? And they'd have to do it. In other words, they could not make policy themselves. He wanted interest rates low. You know the U.S. went through World War II with a 2% interest rate? 2%. Compared to, what do you have on your credit card? 16, 18, 20, 25? Right? You go through World War II with a 2%. You know why? It was possible because Roosevelt would call them up and say, you buy that bond issue at the rate I tell you. So under Roosevelt, the Federal Reserve is de facto nationalized, it's de facto a bureau of the Treasury, and it does exactly what the elected president tells them to do. In 1952, when Roosevelt is dead and the Korean War is on, Truman tries to reassert the ability to dictate interest rates, and they tell him, go jump in the lake. And since he's a contemptible little puppet, that's the end of it. And since then, interest rates have gone into orbit, and that's the usury economy that you see. But if you're concerned about the Federal Reserve, the only one who ever defeated the Federal Reserve, and this over a period of a dozen years, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Little known, huh? Not too easy to find that in Time magazine.
So what emerges as the more sort of obvious parallels with the events of 9/11 and with World War II? Obviously, far different events, different purposes, but some of the players and their positions. When you discussed Richard K. Turner, I thought about the Dave Frasca and Marion Spike Bowman, whose job was to sort of sit on potentially damaging information and hold it until the horse was out of the barn, etc. Are there parallels in the players that you've
I wouldn't try to set up, mechanistic one-to-one comparison, but you sort of see the idea, right?
It's comparative theology, if you will.
It's a coterie of invisible government operatives with strong Anglophile sentiments. Again, they're devoted to oligarchy. The goal of oligarchy is always to preserve oligarchy, and they're against dictatorship. They don't want this. They want a weak state. And of course, what you have today is a weak state. Some people think it's a strong state. They're crazy. We have a government that's, the U.S. government is weaker than J.P. Morgan Chase, weaker than Halliburton, weaker than ExxonMobil. So in our time, well, you have 9/11 as a coup d'etat carried out by a network in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the NSA, in the Treasury, yes, in the Federal Reserve, by all means. They all have to take part, right? There's a whole question of insider trading. If you didn't have the Federal Reserve and the Treasury on board, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, you would have had the whole insider trading stuff would have pointed you right at people who knew or who were doing it one way or the other, who could lead you to people who were doing it. So you have private networks infesting the government. They're not loyal to the Constitution. They don't follow the dictates of the elected president or Congress or whatever it is, but they have their own agenda, and that is set by a private financier network. Therefore, invisible government, parallel government, secret team, rogue network, deep state, deep politics, sometimes called, finance oligarchs, my favorite term, London, New York, the Anglo-Americans, Anglo-American financier faction. That's what has run the world. And of course now their empire is collapsing. It's not so much that they want global dominance, they want to preserve the wretched empire they have, and it's collapsing. So they're forced to do wild things. I mean, look what this guy does. This is bad news, right? It's very, very dangerous to take a empire down this road. And sure enough, his beloved empire is gone within a decade after he does these crazy things. India is gone, and that means the rest of it will be gone pretty soon after that, at least in the formal terms. So I think what you see is a story of imperial desperation by a dying empire, which is what he represents. Similarly, the U.S. today, in terms of the dollar as it has existed, is a dying empire. And these networks then inside the government to try to orchestrate reality in a desperate flight forward, I would say, to try to get the things they want. But they're doomed. And the other problem, of course, is you find that the people who should be opposing them just aren't doing it. That there's not enough vigilance inside the institutions and in the population in general. But I hope also that by seeing this, you can see that 9/11 is not new. Again, we had the assassination attempt on Roosevelt, the fascist march on Washington, Pearl Harbor, and then we could add in all the other stuff, the Kennedy assassination, the Gulf of Tonkin, the U-2, the Bay of Pigs, Watergate, which we did mention, and a couple of others. So you basically got 112 years by now of invisible government machinations, really making a mockery of the idea that it's a government of laws and votes and legality. This is the most illegal country in the world. We have an illegal president. He's been put into power by coups twice, vote fraud coups disguised as elections. The whole political system is based on assassinations. John F. Kennedy, R.F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and so on. We have antitrust laws. They don't exist. We have labor laws. They're violated too. Everything illegal. And I always laugh when people say Mexicans are illegal. Yeah, welcome. So is everything else illegal. It's a completely illegal country. Let's start at the top rather than with the victims down at the bottom.
So we see, obviously the problems here. Is there any solution that comes to mind of what we can, other than education? And I know that's going to be closing the door after the horse is gone, because it's just not possible, I don't think, to educate enough people fast enough. But maybe. But is there anything that comes to mind that you could suggest?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked me that question, because I would be much more optimistic than you seem to be. I think you have to have, first of all, a conjunctural perspective. In other words, if a political system is breaking up, which it is, the party realignment, we love that. If the dollar is in a period of death agony, which it is, this also helps. If you've also got a certain generational constellation, which is emerging in terms of precedents that you can identify in the past, so the Strauss-Howe generation theory. If you've got all that, you're basically drawn to the conclusion, as I am, that today's U.S. political geometry is the most unstable in 150 years. To find anything comparable, you've got to go back to the 1850s. And that turned out to be the verge of a civil war. We have to avoid it. But that's the kind of stuff that you're talking about right now. I see the political spectrum, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, splintered in 7 ways. Not 2 parties, not even 4, like 1860, but 7, at least potentially. So what I recommend is obviously that people should become active. Get active or get radioactive. My slogan, I learned this from a Spanish leftist back in the 1970s. It's a wonderful slogan. It belonged to the Cold War. It's every bit as valuable right now today. And the thing that you can do is an educational perspective, to be sure. If you have an hour this afternoon, call into Limbaugh, Hannity, O'Reilly, right? Barge in there and smash the controlled environment with some vital piece of reality. 9/11, the coming attack on Iran, any number of other things work fine. If you have 3 to 6 hours in an afternoon, get 2 friends, form a 9/11 Truth Squad. 1 question, 1 follow-up, 1 camera person. Wire the talent, right? Make sure the talent is wired. And go confront Hillary, Giuliani, induce a macaca moment, send them packing into, spending more time with their families, which they all say
They're
they
trying.
do.
But they hold these fundraisers up in Rancho
That's
Bernardo
fine.
at
Well,
23 hours
you
a
get them in
plate.
the parking lot. Sabrina Rivera caught Giuliani in the parking lot in the Bronx. You do the same thing.
Yeah.
And then, however, we've done the 1 hour, we've done the 6 hour. If you have 1,000 hours over the next year, run for Congress, and you should. We've already got 1 congressional candidate in here. We need more. If you don't go out there, the only thing you can say to Pelosi is, you can't reason with Pelosi.
Yeah.
You can't say, it's terrible what you're doing, or aren't you ashamed of yourself? You have to say, look, I'm opposing you in the primary, watch out. I'm going to watch every move you make, and maybe I'm not as well funded as you are, but maybe I'm not as hated as you are either. So watch out, I'm coming after you. As soon as you do that, you have caught their undivided attention. Nothing concentrates their mind like the idea of a primary challenge. And indeed, you're not limited to the Democratic Party. You might as well go to the Republican Party. Why not?
But the media has such a leverage on marginalizing challenges that it's
not with the new media. The new media, remember, Time magazine put you on the cover. You are person of the year. You create the news, you go out and film it, you put it up on YouTube, and then O'Reilly and Hannity come to you. I've had this happen to me in the last couple of months. The 9/11 Truth Squad, the Project for the New American Citizen in Austin, Texas, confronted John Forbes Kerry, Boston Brahmin, and his foundation wife, Teresa Heinz Kerry, worth billions. Portuguese fascist family, very interesting, goes back to Salazar in Mozambique. And they asked about Building 7. And a couple of days later, I got a call from Hannity and Colmes saying, come on and talk about Building 7. 7.5 minutes on Hannity and Colmes. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars that we don't have. Later on, when Sabrina Rivera confronted Giuliani in the Bronx, Hannity and Colmes put that up too, and so on. Right? So it's at the Philadelphia Emergency Anti-War Convention last Wednesday, the day before yesterday, right? Wednesday, 4th of July, we had a platform. The platform essentially says, impeach Bush Cheney, stop all wars, stop dictatorship, people not bankers must rule, 9/11 truth. What are you going to do for that? Candidates, take back the airwaves, mass political education, truth squads, generate your own media, legal action, the RICO suit against Bush Cheney, campus organizing, and a bunch of other stuff. So for the first time, we have a comprehensive platform for anti-war, peace, labor, civil rights, civil liberties, impeachment, anti-globalization, anti-tax, 9/11 truth.
Well, I have
Libertarians, conservatives, leftists, independents, apathetic. All welcome.
there is a challenge now to the monopoly of the media, as I noticed that the other day. So it is recognized and is being hopefully dealt with on that level.
Yeah, we're doing it. I mean, join us.
Yeah.
The people here, there's been a very, very good, you were in it too, weren't you?
Yes.
The Truth Squad and
Yes.
this soon-to-be former Congresswoman,
Davis.
Susan Davis.
Susan Davis.
We're at the YouTube attack level right now.
Well, that's what you should do. But now,
Yeah.
she's already said she'd look into it. So look,
Yes.
it's July. You were told. You know or you should have known. In the Nuremberg, right? In the Nuremberg language, you either knew or you should have known. Right? What's
Right.
going on. So you're going to be held accountable
Yes.
for 9/11 truth. Now, don't tell me you're going to look into it.
That's right.
Because we put up with that for a couple of months, but now it's enough. So I would urge you to be I look forward to the future with eager anticipation. I think it's going to be the most fascinating time. I feel like I've been training all my life for this moment. We know what to do.
I think you're right.
We know where we are. We know what's happening. We have an unparalleled grasp of what's happening around us. We really have a monopoly on that. Right? We know the map of the world as it's evolving. We know things even before they're going to happen. We have the best intelligence picture we've ever had. And all we have to do now is be active in the way that we can, and which is more fulfilling really than any other activity, at least in public terms.
Yes.
Webster, I know we have to deliver you to care of Ted and Lise in a little over an hour. So.
Right, wonderful. I hope I've answered any. Can I just ask you? Did I convince you?
I had a question.
Sure.
Yeah, about the presentation. I had read a lot about FDR admiring Joseph Stalin, and really, especially when it came to Yalta, and giving him, a lot. What is how does that? Because in your presentation, he came across as pretty innocent, but I always thought that all those guys were pretty much bad guys.
I hope I didn't try to show innocent, because innocent would mean, in a way, a fool, and I don't think he's a fool. Let's try to dissect the Yalta business. The main complaints you're going to hear about Yalta is somehow that Roosevelt delivered Eastern Europe, Poland, and such places into the hands of Stalin. And the fact, of course, is that these places had been occupied by the Soviet Red Army. So the only way that they would not remain under the Red Army is if you have World War III, now with atomic weapons. And the American people were overwhelmingly opposed to that, and they were right, because that would have been a horrible thing to do. The only person served by continuing the war against the Soviets was Churchill, which he tried to do. So he tried to keep it going. Churchill's plan was to try to either create a clash between the US and the Soviets, or to turn around German units and send them back to the east. There is, of course, the secret surrender. Are you familiar with this? Allen Dulles in northern Italy makes a separate peace deal with SS General Karl Wolff, which makes Stalin very upset, because this is precisely what Stalin, of course, is a famous paranoid, is afraid of, that there's going to be a secret deal by the pro-fascist people on the western side, the US, British, and they're going to turn the fascists back against the Soviets, right? That they're going to continue the war. And on the whole, this, I think, is Churchill's perspective. So Stalin is on firm ground. But if you didn't want Stalin to conquer Poland, then you needed to have the cross-channel invasion in 1942, not in 1944. And it's well known that Churchill is the main person saying, don't have the obvious cross-channel invasion, the Normandy invasion, in 1942 or even in 1943, but wait as long as you can. Why? To maximize Soviet and German losses. Because that's always the goal. He wants, in addition to wanting the US and Japan to be exhausted and bled to death, he wants Russia and Germany to be bled to death and exhausted. So therefore he says, stay out of it until the last moment. Well, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to stay out of it to the last moment to maximize German and Russian war debt, which is Churchill's policy, then you can't be surprised when the Russians end up controlling everything from Trieste to Stettin, right? The so-called Iron Curtain line. So again, Churchill is a bungler and a hypocrite. Now, does Roosevelt like Stalin? Maybe at this level, this is you can read what Elliot Roosevelt says about it. In other words, Elliot Roosevelt in that book, As He Saw It, gives first-person accounts of how Roosevelt is trying very hard to have good relations with Stalin. You know why? Because Roosevelt's perspective is, in the post-war world, the operative alliance is the US and the Soviets. That there'll be a US-Soviet condominium, and that will dominate the world. And he considers that the Soviets will need industrial reconstruction, which will mean that the U.S. will not fall back into the depression of the 1930s, because there'll be a steady stream of Russian factory orders to build all kinds of things, bridges and capital goods and the rest of it. Whereas the British, if you give the British the money, which is then what happened, the British will try to maintain the obsolete empire arrangements, in particular something called the sterling balances, which today is a completely forgotten thing. But if you were in the British Empire, you had to keep a certain amount of money in London in the form of pound sterling. And since Britain was bankrupt, this was almost impossible to maintain. So the U.S. lent the British $3 or $4 billion, which was a huge sum, in post-World War II. And the British, instead of using it to buy capital goods from Detroit or Heartland, industrial U.S., they simply used it for monetary speculation and so forth. So I would say Roosevelt is determined to have good relations with Stalin. Yes. And I think it's the correct policy. Because the alternative is then the Cold War, which you have, which essentially means you're not doing anything for Poland. Poland would have been best served by having a period of relaxation of tensions in Europe after World War II. And it's precisely the British who make this impossible. And I can show you all kinds of quotes of people, Sumner Welles, we saw him today. He says, in about 6 weeks after the death of Roosevelt, the entire Roosevelt policy is completely thrown overboard under the influence of these pro-British Churchill guys, Harriman, Atchison, and Truman, who then come in. And essentially everything that Roosevelt had planned for in terms of long-term cooperation with the Soviets, above all this thing about dismantling the British Empire, this is completely abandoned. Now think about this. The U.S. was considered an anti-imperialist power, a big plus. What are the main disasters of the U.S. in the post-war period? Vietnam, colonial intervention, essentially in support of the French, the stuff in the Middle East now, which is really a continuation of the British Empire in Iraq and in the Gulf and in Kuwait and all the rest of it. In Iran, too, it's the same thing. Colonialism and imperialism in the British mode. The one good moment to the U.S. is the Suez Crisis, 1956, where the British and the French attack Egypt, and the U.S. and the Soviets join together and say, stop it. And they have to stop it. And the position of the U.S. in the Middle East after 1956 is mainly based on Arab good feeling that the U.S. had stopped the British and the French colonialists from humiliating Egypt in 1956. So I think you can make a very good conclusive case that what Roosevelt was doing was the smart thing to do. And he wanted to have good relations with Stalin. Obviously not easy to do, because as they say, he's a famous paranoid. And he has, his history is a very dark one. But, what are you going to do? Have World War III? Because these basically, you can either have good relations, a Cold War, or World War III. So choose. What would you choose?
What about a non-interventionist policy? Just don't.
What does it mean?
Well, you don't have to be buddies with the UK. You don't have to be.
I think the world is much too small for this. Plus, you've got these forces in Central Europe now. What are you going to do with those? You're going to bring them home? Well, you can, but then the temptation for poor Stalin becomes tremendous. As a matter of fact, there's a saying that when the U.S. demobilized, right? The U.S. demobilized in 1945. The U.S. went from about 12 million under arms down to about 500,000. And the Soviets never got over this. They couldn't believe their eyes. They couldn't imagine. The U.S. Navy went from 1,000 ships to 200. This was too quick. It could have been done, it could have been done rapidly, but a little bit more gradually, with a little bit more thinking. Because, of course, the reason they did this is say, we have the atomic bomb, we don't need this. We'll do it on the cheap, Rumsfeld, right? Typical Rumsfeld mentality. Whereas you might say, stability might have been better served by doing that a little bit more carefully and a little bit more slowly. But I think by the time you get to 1945, with intercontinental bombers and atomic bombs, the world is too small for non-intervention. You have to be constructively engaged. You shouldn't be invading other countries, but you have to be constructively engaged. You see what I mean?
Right. Trading partners is fine, but attacking countries and
you're right. You've got to have something like, what should the future of Europe be? And remember, at this point, Europe is going to be a ward of somebody. Japan is going to be a ward of somebody, because they're both destroyed. Right? You've got to have a Marshall Plan for Europe and a Marshall Plan for Japan. And I think that was Very good. The Marshall Plan should have been brought in 1945 with the Soviets invited to join. And there you have it. Then you'd have golden peace for 100 years. But the British are able to force the Soviets into a very hostile posture through a whole series of things that they did. They did the Civil War in Greece. They did the secret surrender, and so forth. So it's basically the British always trying to split the U.S. and the Soviets to preserve their own importance. Because if there's a U.S.-Soviet embrace, the British are going to be crushed in the middle. You see what I mean? I don't think it's just, the 1920s is a time when the U.S. does what I think you're saying, is basically say, to hell with you all. And that's when the British are able to sponsor Mussolini and then Hitler. So in other words, if you say we're not going to intervene, it means you're leaving Europe to the British. No, I wouldn't do that. That's much too dangerous.
In the eye of the hurricane through World War I and World War II, you have a little country named Switzerland. How is it? What is your take on their maintaining a geopolitical hands-off position through all the turmoil and the tumult that existed through those years, those horrific war years when everything was succumbing to one movement one way or the other, and this little country just sits there with no armaments and no expenses and
they're armed to the teeth.
well, as a citizenry, every household has got a gun.
They're armed. I'll tell you some stories. I was just in Switzerland last September. As a matter of fact, I was part of the main German language event for the 5th anniversary. So this is a place called Kandern-Holzen. I stayed in Basel, Switzerland, with the guy that I mentioned, my friend Thomas Meyer of Der Europäer. He is the anti-CIA faction of the anthroposophic movement, the Rudolf Steiner Waldorf schools worldwide. And he's written this book about it, which I think focuses on Roosevelt much more than I would, but very valuable contribution. And what he's really concerned about there, I think, is similar to what David Ray Griffin says, that there's a demonic evil force dominating the United States. And I would subscribe to that completely. And since the Kennedy assassination, it's not part of the land of the people, but it's part of the political arrangement.
It's become obvious since then, yeah.
Now, Switzerland. If you travel around Switzerland, have you ever?
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, you can see these things where you're driving, anytime there's a stretch of straight road, there's a bunker, and there's a jet fighter in the bunker, because they're going to bring that out, because they have a completely decentralized air force. So they can launch jet fighters of a rather sophisticated kind off pieces of highway. They've got these things in the mountains where you're driving along a bridge and you realize that the thing is set up to revolve around and turn into a fortress. In other words, it's going to turn around and be a fort. And then you're in the streetcar in Zurich, and the guy comes in with a huge machine gun that he's taking, to the office for lunch and everything. I once had a manual of the Swiss Army. This was really something. It shows people surrendering. It says, "We can't do that. We have to keep fighting until they kill us. We can always kill more of them." So it's this, Now, the Swiss, of course, were mercenaries. And still are. When you go to the Vatican, those guys are Swiss. You try to talk to those guys in Italian, they are Swiss peasants. They speak only the Swiss mountain dialect. So the Swiss guards in the Vatican in the colorful Michelangelo uniforms are Swiss mercenaries. In the 1400s to 1500s, they are the main mercenaries, but a lot of them get killed. In the more recent history of Switzerland, there's a thing called the War of the Schutzbund in the 1850s and 60s. It's around the same time as the U.S. Civil War. There's a it's not a large-scale civil war, but a serious one in Switzerland, and that seems to have created this regime that they have, which of course is an oligarchy, right? And it's based on the banking power of Zurich and Geneva, and a complex story.
I don't think anybody's even been through there. They just sort of walk around it, don't they? In fact, it's like a giant no-fly zone. Nobody even bothers.
It is a studiously neutral country. They did, of course, cooperate rather largely with the Nazis because all the trains from Italy to Germany had to go back and forth through Switzerland. As a matter of fact, there's a famous episode where the U.S. slapped a food embargo on Switzerland in the winter of 1944 to 1945, and this accounts for a certain unmistakable degree of anti-U.S. hatred of people who remember being hungry in the winter of 44 to 45, because the U.S. could have had shipments going in through France in particular into Switzerland, but did not. So there's a lot of resentment about that. So I don't know what conclusions we can draw about this in a major way. It's just that they, Hitler at different times considered attacking, decided not to. The other thing is, the Rütli Oath in Schiller's William Tell, where the Swiss get together and they swear this oath that they're going to stick together. In 1939, at the beginning of World War II, the head of the Swiss army gets the French, Italian, German, and Rhaeto-Romanish components of the Swiss army together, and he goes to this sacred forest where the Rütli Oath was sworn, and he makes them all swear it again. So they're going to resist. Right? They're not going to surrender. They're not going to divide, secede, or anything like that. And today it's a very prosperous country. I mean, I would find it somewhat narrow. But it's tremendous financial power.
Yeah.
More recently, it's been one of the headquarters of the yen carry trade. Because if you were borrowing your free yen, your 0% yen in Tokyo, you could take it to Switzerland. But I really don't know what to conclude, like a general judgment about Switzerland. Just I would say that there are many fine people there. 9/11 Truth Movement is very strong. The best German language magazine for all the German area of 100 million people is Der Europäer of Basel. And again, the editor is my friend Thomas Meyer, who has written the book about Pearl Harbor. And again, his conclusions are somewhat different from what I'm telling you, but again, a very valuable book that I would highly recommend. And it is translated into English. Thomas Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. Der Europäer. And I've written articles for them, and they had the best coverage of 9/11 Truth of any magazine in Germany or the German area.
Wouldn't it just be the terrain? I mean, they're armed to the tilt. They've got these huge mountains all everywhere.
Well, it's not everywhere. If you're approaching it from Italy, it looks like it's everywhere. But if you're approaching from France, it's not. And if you're approaching from Germany, there's a flat area. Like when you go from when you come from Germany to Basel, it's flat. So then there are foothills that begin after that. It's interesting that if you go to Basel, there's one suburban station of Basel that's already in Germany. The station is in Germany. And it's part of the Basel subway system. That's where this conference was. Handenholzen, the Rudolf Steiner Academy last September. Anyway, I really like Switzerland, but I can't give a judgment any other way.
I heard that let me see, the center, the Masonic order, and the banking system were cohabitors of the same building or something like that in Zurich, I think it was.
Well, it's well known. You have this thing called the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. It's the railroad station street. And here you have the big three: Credit Suisse, Union Bank of Switzerland, and Swiss Bank Corporation, Schweizerische Bankgesellschaft. The other thing I have to tell you, I should have mentioned it, one of the first big international 9/11 conferences was the Lucerne Conference of November 2003 with Begich, Thomas Meyer, Rupert, Peter Dale Scott, von Bülow, Wisniewski, myself. There were two conferences in Berlin, August and October 2003, and then there was the Lucerne Conference, and that's the beginning of the 9/11 Truth Movement as an organized force in the world.
Didn't it originally start in France, and then
Thierry Masson? I think if you wanted to say somebody founded the 9/11 Truth Movement, I would say Thierry Masson of the Voltaire Network in Paris, who put up within about 2 weeks no Boeing at the Pentagon. And that was obviously very important. He has just published a second edition of his book, which he has sent me, and I have to report I haven't read it yet because it's a big book and I've been running around. But this summer I'm certainly going to get to that. And he's a wonderful guy. And you should look at his website. Voltaire Network. Voltaire. Just look Maison Voltaire or Voltaire Network. And it's in various languages. The English language part is maybe not the most developed, but maybe that can change. Well, man, thank you so much.